Hey, Reddit. I know a lot of you probably won't believe this, but I need to get it off my chest. I need someone to hear this because honestly, I don't know how much time I have left. My life is a complete mess right now, and it's all because I made the worst mistake of my life on the dark web. I'm not proud of it, but I have to own up to my mistakes, and maybe, just maybe, someone will learn from this and avoid the same fate. It all started about 6 months ago. I'm not exactly the most responsible guy, I'll admit that up front. I've always been curious about the darker corners of the internet, the places people don't talk about openly. The morbid curiosity, that thrill of exploring something forbidden, it got to me. I'd been on the dark web before, just browsing, mostly just weird stuff, creepy forums, some illegal markets that I never actually bought anything from. But I always told myself it was just for the thrill. But this time, I went too far. One night, I was sitting in my dingy apartment, drinking alone, which had become a bad habit lately. I'd lost my job a few weeks before, and things weren't looking up. I was already spiraling. That night, I found a forum I hadn't seen before. It was a place where people could hire services. And I'm not talking about drugs or weapons. This was darker. Hits, kidnappings, blackmail. The kind of shit you don't think really exists until you see it with your own eyes. I don't know why I didn't just close my laptop and walk away, but I didn't. I guess I was just feeling invincible, or maybe I was just fucking stupid. Either way, I kept browsing. I saw all sorts of twisted offers, but one post caught my eye. It was titled, "Punishment for the Guilty." The guy who posted it called himself the Judge, and he claimed he could find out anyone's darkest secrets and ruin their life, or worse. The post was filled with testimonials, people claiming he'd done things I can't even repeat here. I should have walked away. But instead, I clicked on the link and it took me to a chat room. The screen name "The Judge" popped up, and before I could even think of what to say, he sent me a message. "You're not here by accident. I was drunk, remember?" So I replied with some cocky bullshit, something like, "Prove it." He didn't respond for a few minutes, and I started to get this sinking feeling in my gut. Then, suddenly, a message popped up. It was my full name, my address, and the names of my parents. My heart dropped. I remember my hands started shaking as I stared at the screen. I tried to play it cool, but I was freaking out. How the hell did this guy know who I was? Then he sent me a photo. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the best of me. It was a picture of me. Not just any picture. It was me sitting at my desk, in my apartment, at that exact moment. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. I immediately looked around the room, trying to find where the camera was, but I couldn't see anything. The only light was the dull glow of my laptop screen. Before I could do anything, another message came through. "I know everything about you." I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. I shot back with something like, "What do you want?" The reply was instant. "To play a game." Now, I know this sounds like some cheesy horror movie shit, but I swear to God, this is exactly how it happened. I don't know what I was thinking, but I typed, "What kind of game?" His response was chilling. "A life for a life. You wronged someone, didn't you?" I didn't reply. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what he meant. But then he sent me another message. "You stole from your old boss, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. He was right. I'd taken money from the till a few times at my last job. It wasn't a lot, just enough to get by when things were tight, but it was still wrong. I never got caught, but somehow, this guy knew. "I can make this go away," he wrote, "but you have to do something for me." I was too deep in by this point. I should have just unplugged my computer, moved out, something. But no, I kept typing. "What do you want?" He sent me an address. It was somewhere in the city, not too far from where I lived. Then he said, "Go there tomorrow night. Bring a knife." I nearly puked. I wasn't some kind of psycho. I didn't know what the hell he was asking me to do, but it was clear it wasn't good. I tried to back out, told him I wasn't interested, that this was all a mistake. But he sent me one last message that sealed my fate. "If you don't, I'll ruin you. And if you go to the cops, your parents will pay the price." That was it. The chat ended. And no matter how many times I tried to log back in or find the forum, it was gone, just vanished, like it never existed. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some sick prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I was a wreck. I couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. All I could do was obsess over that address and what he wanted me to do. By the time the sun set, I was in a full-blown panic. But I was also desperate. I couldn't go to the cops. I believed him when he said he'd hurt my family. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to that address. The place was an old, run-down apartment building in a shitty part of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. I sat in my car for a while, just staring at it, trying to get the courage to go inside. I was shaking so bad I almost dropped the knife I'd brought. Yeah, I actually brought it. I don't know what the fuck I was thinking, but I did it. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and into the building. The hallway was dark, and it smelled like piss and mold. I found the apartment number he'd given me and stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the door. Before I could knock, the door creaked open on its own. The apartment was pitch black, but I could hear someone breathing inside. I took a step forward, and that's when I felt it, a cold, sharp pain in my side. I gasped, and when I looked down, I saw the blade sticking out of me. I stumbled back, clutching my side, but there was no one there. The door was still open, the apartment still dark. I pulled the knife out, wincing at the pain, and ran. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of the streetlights as I sped home, blood soaking through my shirt, my vision blurring. I made it back to my apartment somehow, and I tried to patch myself up. The wound wasn't as deep as I thought, but it was bad enough. I was bleeding everywhere, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept expecting the door to burst open, for someone to finish the job, but no one came. That was the first night, the beginning of all this. Since then, it's only gotten worse. I keep getting messages, threats, pictures of me when I'm least expecting it. The guy knows everything about me, and he's not going to stop until he's ruined my life, or until I'm dead. I'm writing this because I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I've been looking over my shoulder every second of every day, waiting for the next attack, and I know it's coming. I know I'm fucked. If anyone's reading this, please learn from my mistake. Don't go looking for trouble on the dark web, because you might just find it. And if you do, there's no getting out. I don't know how I made it through the first night after what happened. I barely slept. I kept checking the door, the windows, and even the closets like some paranoid freak. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. It felt like my heart was permanently lodged in my throat. But somehow, I managed to pass out from sheer exhaustion sometime in the early morning. When I woke up, it was already late afternoon, and I was drenched in cold sweat. The first thing I noticed was the dried blood on my side, caked around the wound. It wasn't deep enough to need stitches, but it hurt like hell. I cleaned myself up as best as I could, wincing with every movement. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened, what I had gotten myself into. My first thought was to go to the cops, but then I remembered his warning. If I went to the police, my family would pay the price. And after what I'd seen, I believed him. This wasn't some internet tough guy bluffing from behind a screen. This was someone who could actually make good on his threats. Someone who already knew everything about me. After I patched myself up, I just sat there in my shitty apartment, staring at my laptop. Part of me wanted to smash it, to destroy any connection to that cursed part of the internet. But I couldn't. I needed answers, needed to know what the hell was happening to me. But when I tried to log back into the dark web, the forum was gone. The judge, or whatever he called himself, had covered his tracks perfectly. It was like that night had never happened, except for the searing pain in my side that reminded me it had. Hours passed. I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment, and every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, my pulse would spike. I was a prisoner in my own home, waiting for something to happen. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind from the waiting, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. My nerves were shot, and the idea of getting another message from him made me nauseous. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I picked up the phone, and sure enough, it was a text from an unknown number. "You're still alive. Good." My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I didn't want to reply, didn't want to engage with him, but I needed to know what he wanted from me. I texted back, "What do you want?" The reply was instant. "The game continues tomorrow, 10 p.m. Check your email." I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to throw my phone across the room, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I sat there staring at the screen, trying to process what this sick bastard had planned for me next. The hours dragged on, but I couldn't do anything to calm down. I couldn't even bring myself to eat. My appetite had vanished, along with any sense of safety I'd ever had. I kept pacing, trying to think of a way out, but there was nothing. He had me cornered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. It was another text. Check your email now. My hands were trembling as I opened my laptop. My inbox was mostly filled with spam and junk, but there was one new email that stood out. It was from an address I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was from. The subject line read, "Instructions." I clicked on it and my stomach dropped. The email was short, just a few lines, but what it said made my blood run cold. You have 24 hours to follow these instructions. If you fail, the consequences will be dire. Go to the address below and pick up the package. Do not open it. Bring it to the location I'll send you at 10 p.m. tomorrow. Remember, I'm watching you. Attached was a new address, this one in a different part of the city. It was an industrial area, mostly abandoned warehouses and factories, the kind of place where no one would notice if something terrible happened to you. My first instinct was to ignore it, to run as far away as I could. But I knew there was no running from this. He'd find me, and he'd make me pay. Or worse, he'd make my family pay. I couldn't let that happen. I had no choice but to play along. The next day was a blur. I was in a constant state of panic, barely holding it together. I spent hours debating whether I should tell someone, maybe a friend, but what could they do? I didn't want to drag anyone else into this nightmare, so I kept it to myself, hoping against hope that I'd find a way out. As night fell, I knew it was time to go. I took a deep breath, grabbed my car keys, and headed out. The drive to the address he'd given me was one of the longest of my life. Every minute, every second felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding, and my palms were slick with sweat. When I finally pulled up to the location, I realized just how isolated it was. There was no one around for miles. Perfect place to disappear. I parked the car and stepped out, the cool night air doing nothing to calm my nerves. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but the place was dead quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway. The building was an old warehouse, the kind that had been abandoned for years. The windows were shattered, and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I had to do this. The inside was even worse. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my feet. I felt like I was being watched, but there was no one there. I made my way through the darkness, using the flashlight on my phone to guide me. It wasn't long before I found the package he'd mentioned. It was a small, unmarked box, sitting on a rotting wooden crate. It looked so ordinary, so out of place in this decrepit hellhole, that it made my skin crawl. I didn't touch it at first. I just stood there, staring at it, feeling like I was on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into the abyss. But I knew there was no turning back now. I grabbed the package and hurried back to my car, my nerves shot, my hands trembling. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring at the box. What the hell was inside? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last, but I couldn't open it. He'd been clear about that, and something told me that if I did, I wouldn't like what I found. Finally, I put the car in gear and drove home, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone tailing me, but the streets were empty. When I got back to my apartment, I took the box inside, placing it on the table like it was a bomb about to go off. The rest of the night was agony. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I kept checking the time, waiting for 10 p.m., dreading what was going to happen next. The hours dragged by, each one more torturous than the last. And then, finally, my phone buzzed. It was him. The message was simple. Bring the package to the old bridge. You have 15 minutes. I grabbed the box, my heart pounding in my chest, and bolted out the door. The old bridge was about a 10-minute drive from my place, a forgotten relic of the city's past that no one used anymore. It was dark and isolated, the perfect place for something terrible to happen. When I arrived, the place was deserted, just as I'd expected. The wind howled through the rusted beams, and the river below looked like a black void, ready to swallow me whole. I stepped out of the car, clutching the package tightly, and walked to the middle of the bridge. I stood there, waiting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence was deafening, and every second felt like an eternity. Then, out of the darkness, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they sent a chill down my spine. I turned, and there he was. A man, dressed in black, his face obscured by a hood. He moved with an unnatural calm, like he had all the time in the world. He stopped a few feet away from me, and I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face. "Give me the package," he said, his voice low and cold. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to run, to do anything but hand over that box. But I knew I didn't have a choice. I extended my hand, offering him the package. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing against mine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. He didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he'd appeared. I stood there for a long time, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. I was in too deep, and there was no getting out now. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. What was in that package? Who was that man? And, most importantly, what was going to happen to me now? When I got back to my apartment, I found another email waiting for me. This one was even shorter than the last. "Well done, the game continues." I threw my phone across the room in a fit of rage, but it didn't make me feel any better. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. After that night on the bridge, I thought things might calm down, that maybe I had somehow managed to satisfy this psycho's twisted game. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. The next few days were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I was living on edge, jumping at every little noise, every knock on the door, every ring of the phone. I stopped sleeping entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man on the bridge, his cold, empty presence lingering in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every move I made was being monitored. I tried to go about my life as normally as I could, but nothing felt normal anymore. I stopped going outside unless I absolutely had to. I barely ate, barely spoke to anyone. My apartment became a prison, each wall closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of my own fear. I kept waiting for the next message, the next sick task I'd have to carry out, but it didn't come. The silence was almost worse than the actual threats. It was like waiting for the blade to fall, knowing it's coming, but not knowing when. Then, about a week later, it happened. I was lying on my couch, staring blankly at the ceiling, when I heard a knock on the door. My heart stopped. I hadn't ordered anything, wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it was him, that he'd finally come to finish what he started. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw a delivery guy standing there, holding a package. I hesitated, but I knew I had to open the door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and took the package from the guy. He gave me a weird look, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in days, which was true. I mumbled a thanks and shut the door, locking it behind me. The package was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. My stomach churned as I set it on the table, staring at it like it was a ticking time bomb. I knew who it was from. I didn't even need to open it to know that whatever was inside was bad news, but I had to know. I grabbed a knife and carefully slid open the paper, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts. Inside was a small box, and when I lifted the lid, I nearly dropped it in shock. It was a phone, a cheap burner phone. No brand, no markings, just a plain black phone sitting there, as innocent as could be. But I knew better. My hands were sweating as I picked it up, half expecting it to explode in my hand. But nothing happened. It just lay there, cold and silent. I turned it on, and immediately a message popped up on the screen. "Answer when it rings." That was it. No instructions, no threats, just a simple command. I felt sick. I didn't want to keep this thing, didn't want anything to do with it. But what choice did I have? I knew I couldn't ignore it. Whatever sick game this guy was playing, I was stuck in it. The phone didn't ring that day, or the next. But the dread of it happening was enough to keep me in a constant state of anxiety. I carried the phone with me everywhere, like a ball and chain, waiting for the inevitable. I even took it to the bathroom with me, afraid that if I missed the call, something terrible would happen. Then, one night, it finally happened. I was sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the TV I wasn't really watching, when the phone buzzed in my pocket. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I fumbled to pull it out, my heart racing as I stared at the screen. It was an unknown number, of course. I didn't want to answer it. I wanted to throw the phone out the window and pretend this was all just some sick nightmare, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the damn thing, but I managed to press answer and bring it to my ear. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Just the faint sound of breathing, so soft I could barely hear it. I wanted to say something, to scream at whoever was on the other end, but my throat was too tight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a voice spoke. "I know what you did." The voice was distorted, like it had been run through some kind of voice changer, but it didn't need to be clear. The message was crystal clear. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, even though I knew it was pointless. The voice chuckled, a low, chilling sound that made my blood run cold. "Don't play dumb. I know everything. The money you stole, the lies you've told, the people you've hurt." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. How the hell did he know about that? I'd always been careful, made sure there was no trail leading back to me. But somehow, this guy knew, and he wasn't done. "There's a price for everything," he continued, his tone calm, almost casual. "And now, it's time to pay up." "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was a pause, and then he said, "You'll find out soon enough. For now, I need you to follow my instructions. You don't want to disappoint me, do you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was a mess, trying to process what was happening, but he didn't wait for a response. "There's a park a few blocks from your apartment. Be there in 30 minutes. Bring the phone. And don't even think about calling the cops. You know what will happen if you do." The line went dead, and I just sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding. I felt trapped, cornered. I knew I couldn't refuse, but the thought of walking into another one of his twisted setups made me want to throw up. But I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my coat, stuffed the phone in my pocket, and headed out into the night. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only comes late at night when most people are safely tucked away in their beds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was following me. The park was empty when I arrived, the swings creaking in the wind, the playground cast in long, eerie shadows. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, when the phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message. "Go to the bench near the fountain." I looked around, my heart racing. The fountain was at the center of the park, a large, ornate structure that hadn't worked in years. The water was stagnant, a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and the whole place had an unsettling vibe. I walked over to the bench, my footsteps echoing in the empty park. When I got there, I noticed something lying on the bench. A small, plain envelope, the kind you'd use to send a letter. My stomach churned as I picked it up, half expecting it to be some kind of trap. But it was just an envelope, sealed with a single piece of tape. I hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my hands trembling, and read the message scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "Choose wisely, left or right." That was it. Just those 3 words. I stood there, staring at the paper, my mind racing. What the hell was this supposed to mean? Left or right? Was he watching me right now, waiting for me to make a move? I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The park was empty, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I knew I had to make a decision, but what was the right one? What would happen if I chose wrong? My phone buzzed again. Another message. "Time's running out." I had to choose, but I had no idea what I was choosing between. Left or right? It seemed so simple, so arbitrary, but I knew it wasn't. Not with this guy. Finally, I made a decision. I turned left and started walking, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't just stand there forever. I hadn't gone more than a few steps when the phone buzzed again. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat as I pulled it out and looked at the screen. Another message. Just 2 words this time. "Good choice." I let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. I knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning of whatever sick game he was playing, and I was the pawn. I started walking again, faster this time, desperate to get out of the park, to get away from whatever horrors were waiting in the shadows. But as I left the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every step I took was being tracked. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a game anymore. This was my life, and I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The days following that night at the park were a blur. I was spiraling, losing my grip on reality. Every second felt like a ticking time bomb, and every shadow seemed to hold some unspeakable horror. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that bridge, hearing that distorted voice echo in my head, or in the park, making a choice that I didn't understand but knew had consequences. I was becoming a shell of myself, a ghost living in a prison of paranoia and fear. I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Strange cars parked outside my apartment at odd hours. People staring at me a little too long on the street. And worst of all, the sense that I was never really alone, that someone was always watching. I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself from the mounting dread, but nothing worked. Every time I thought I was alone, the phone would buzz, reminding me that my life was no longer my own. The messages were cryptic, always telling me to wait, to be patient, that I'd hear from him soon. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, and any misstep could send me plummeting into the abyss. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take the waiting anymore, the phone rang. It was late at night, and I was sitting in my apartment, trying to drown out the silence with the TV. The sound startled me so much I nearly dropped the phone. My hands were trembling as I answered, not bothering to check the number. I already knew who it was. The same distorted voice greeted me, calm and detached, as if this was just another day at the office for him. "It's time," he said, his words cutting through the static like a knife. I didn't even bother asking what he meant. I knew better by now. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "There's a place you need to go," he replied. "An old factory on the edge of town. You know the one." I did. Everyone in the city knew about the old steel factory. It had been shut down years ago, left to rot, and had since become a magnet for all kinds of shady activities. People said it was haunted, that bad things happened there. It was the last place I wanted to go, but I knew I didn't have a choice. "Be there in an hour," he continued, "and bring the phone. Don't be late." The line went dead before I could respond. I just sat there for a moment, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I knew I should have been used to this by now, but the fear was still as fresh as it had been the first night. My gut was screaming at me not to go, but I knew what would happen if I didn't. I grabbed my keys, the phone, and headed out into the night. The streets were empty, the city asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere out there, he was waiting for me, watching my every move. The drive to the factory was short, but it felt like it took forever. The closer I got, the more the dread settled in my bones, a cold, gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. By the time I pulled up to the old rusted gates, I was shaking so badly I could barely keep the car steady. The factory loomed in the darkness, a hulking, decaying structure that seemed to breathe malevolence. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in graffiti, and the whole place reeked of abandonment and decay. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to summon the courage to get out. The phone buzzed in my pocket, urging me on, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and made my way toward the entrance. The place was dead silent. Not even the wind dared to blow through the broken windows. I pushed open the rusted door, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The inside of the factory was even worse than the outside. It was pitch black, the only light coming from my phone's screen. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rust and mildew. Every step I took echoed in the vast emptiness, making it feel like I was walking into the mouth of some enormous beast. I followed the instructions he'd sent me, moving deeper into the factory, the sense of dread growing with each step. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. Finally, I reached the room he'd described, a large open space that had once been the heart of the factory. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were covered in grime and old machinery. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single flickering overhead light, was a chair. And in that chair, sat a man. He was tied up, his hands bound behind him, a bag over his head. He was struggling, making muffled noises through the gag in his mouth. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. This was no random scene. This was a setup, a trap, and I was the bait. The phone buzzed in my hand, snapping me out of my daze. I looked down at the screen and saw a new message. Take off the bag. I hesitated, my mind racing. I didn't want to do this, didn't want to know who was under that bag, but I knew I had no choice. I walked over to the chair, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly reached out to pull the bag off. What I saw made me stumble back, nearly falling over in shock. It was my old boss, the one I'd stolen from. His face was battered and bruised, one eye swollen shut, blood caked on his skin. He looked up at me with a mixture of fear and anger, his muffled screams pleading for help. I wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but my feet were glued to the floor. This wasn't just some random person. This was someone I knew, someone whose life I'd ruined, and now he was here, at the mercy of this sick bastard. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Finish what you started. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process what he was asking me to do. He wanted me to kill him, to finish what I'd started when I stole from him. My hands were shaking, the phone slipping from my grip as the horror of the situation sank in. I couldn't do it. I wasn't a killer. I was just some idiot who'd made a mistake, who'd gotten in over his head. But as I looked at my boss, at the fear in his eyes, I knew that if I didn't do this, if I didn't follow the instructions, things would only get worse. I backed away, shaking my head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding my thoughts. I couldn't do it. There had to be another way. But as soon as I thought that, the phone buzzed again. I picked it up, dread pooling in my stomach as I read the message. If you don't, I will. And then I'll come for you. My blood ran cold. I knew he meant it. This wasn't some empty threat. This was a promise. And the way he'd said, come for you, made it clear that whatever he'd do to me would be far worse than death. I looked at my boss again, at the desperation in his eyes, and I knew I was out of time. I had to make a decision. I had to choose between my life and his. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I moved. My body acted on its own, like I was in some kind of trance. I walked over to the table where the tools were laid out, an assortment of knives, hammers, and other instruments of pain, each one more horrifying than the last. I picked up the knife, the weight of it unfamiliar and wrong in my hand. My boss started thrashing in the chair, his muffled screams growing louder as he realized what was happening. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't face the reality of what I was about to do. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the knife. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. The fear, the guilt, the horror of what I was about to do, it was too much. But I knew I had to do it. I had no choice. If I didn't, this nightmare would never end. I'd be trapped in this hell forever, hunted by a man who had the power to destroy me, who had already started to destroy me. I stepped closer, the knife trembling in my hand, and raised it over his chest. My boss was crying now, his whole body shaking with fear. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, trying to pretend that this wasn't real, that I wasn't about to kill a man in cold blood. But it was real, and there was no escaping it. I brought the knife down, the blade sinking into his chest with a sickening crunch. His body jerked, a horrible guttural sound escaping his gagged mouth. I wanted to stop, wanted to pull back, but I couldn't. The knife seemed to have a life of its own, driving deeper into his chest with every ounce of my strength. Blood spurted out, warm and sticky, coating my hands as I pushed harder, trying to end it as quickly as possible. His muffled screams pierced my ears, his body convulsing under the force of the blow. I felt like I was being torn apart inside, every thrust of the knife driving a shard of guilt deeper into my soul. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped moving. His body went limp, and the only sound left in the room was my own ragged breathing. I staggered back, the knife slipping from my blood-soaked hands and clattering to the floor. I collapsed to my knees, the horror of what I'd just done crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I had killed a man I knew, a man I'd wronged, and now his blood was on my hands, both literally and figuratively. The phone buzzed again and I nearly screamed at the sound. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to see what he had to say, but I knew I had to. My shaking hands fumbled to pick it up, and when I finally read the message, it was like a punch to the gut. "Well done, now clean up your mess." I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Clean up my mess? What the hell did that even mean? But deep down, I knew exactly what he meant. I had to get rid of the body, erase any evidence of what had happened here tonight. I wasn't just a murderer now. I was a criminal, a man with a secret that could never see the light of day. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak and unsteady. My boss's body was slumped in the chair, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't face the reality of what I'd done, but I knew I had to. I had to finish this. I grabbed the tools he'd left me, a tarp, some rope, and a few other things I didn't want to think about. The next few hours were a blur of grim determination and numb detachment. I wrapped the body in the tarp, tying it up with the rope to make sure it was secure. The whole time, I felt like I was watching myself from a distance, like this was all some horrible nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I was done, I dragged the body to my car, my muscles straining under the weight. The factory was deserted, and the streets were still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that he was out there somewhere, making sure I did exactly as he instructed. The drive to the river was the longest of my life. I kept expecting to see flashing lights in the rearview mirror, to hear the sirens of police cars closing in on me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty streets and the sickening realization that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. When I reached the river, I parked the car near an old, crumbling pier. The water was dark and still, reflecting the cold light of the moon. I dragged the body out of the trunk, my muscles screaming in protest, and hauled it to the edge of the pier. I hesitated for a moment, staring down at the water, my mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts, but I knew there was no turning back. This was the final step. With a grunt of effort, I pushed the body off the edge and watched as it disappeared into the black water below. There was a soft splash, and then nothing. Just the sound of the river lapping against the shore. It was done. I had committed the ultimate sin, and now there was no escaping the consequences. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I climbed back into the car and drove away, my mind numb from the horror of what I had done. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in the dark, unable to move, unable to think. The phone was still in my hand, but it was silent now. No more messages, no more instructions. Just the deafening silence of my own guilt. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something, anything, to escape the suffocating weight of what I'd done. I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I typed out a message to him, the man who had orchestrated this nightmare. What now? For a long time, there was no response. I started to wonder if he was done with me, if he had finally gotten what he wanted. But then, just as I was about to give up, the phone buzzed. "Enjoy your life." I stared at the message, disbelief washing over me. That was it? After everything he'd put me through, after everything I'd done, that was all he had to say? But deep down, I knew what he meant. I might have survived his twisted game, but my life was over. I was a murderer now, a man haunted by the memory of what I'd done. There was no going back, no undoing the horror I'd unleashed. The phone buzzed again, and this time there was an attachment. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but I knew I had to see what it was. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. It was a video of me, killing my boss. The camera had been hidden somewhere in the factory, capturing every gruesome detail of what I'd done. The blood, the terror, the moment his life ended at my hands. It was all there, laid out in sickening detail. And then, as the video played out, the screen went black, and a final message appeared. "I'll be in touch." The phone slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor as I stared at it, my mind racing. He wasn't done with me. This was just the beginning. He had the video, the proof of my crime, and he could ruin me with it whenever he wanted. I was trapped, a puppet on his strings, and there was no escape. I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't go to the police. They'll never believe me, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. He has the evidence, the power, and he's made it clear that he can and will destroy me whenever he pleases. I'm living on borrowed time, waiting for the moment he decides to pull the trigger. Every day, every hour, I'm looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next message, the next command. I'm a prisoner in my own life, and there's no way out. So, if you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from the dark web. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you, because once you step into that world, there's no coming back. You'll be trapped, just like I am, living in constant fear, waiting for the end. And trust me, you don't want to know what happens next. After that video, things started to change. It wasn't like before, where I was just waiting for the next command, the next task. No, this time, it was different. This time, he was inside my head. Every day, every waking moment, I could feel him there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, pulling the strings, the fear, the paranoia. It consumed me. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound, every creak in the floorboards. I knew he was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I started getting messages at random times, just to remind me that he was still there, still in control. Sometimes it was just a simple, "I'm watching you." Other times it was more detailed, more personal. He'd tell me things about my life, things no one else could possibly know, like the name of my childhood dog, or the exact number of steps from my apartment door to the mailbox. It was like he was inside my head, digging through my memories, and it drove me to the brink of madness. I tried to keep going, tried to live my life like nothing had changed, but it was impossible. I couldn't escape the fear, the constant anxiety that any second my world would come crashing down. I stopped going out altogether, barricading myself in my apartment like a hermit. The only time I ever left was to buy supplies, and even then, I'd be looking over my shoulder the entire time, convinced that he was following me, that he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the worst part wasn't the fear. The worst part was the guilt. It gnawed at me, day and night, a constant reminder of what I'd done. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, my boss's face, twisted in pain, in fear as I took his life. I couldn't escape it, couldn't forget it. It haunted me, driving me deeper into a pit of despair. And then, one night, the phone rang. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the horrible possibilities of what he might ask me to do next. The sound of the phone made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached for it. I knew who it was before I even looked at the screen. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" His voice was different this time, calm, almost soothing, like he was trying to lull me into a false sense of security. "It's time to end this," he said, his tone unnervingly gentle. "You've done well, but there's one last thing you need to do." I didn't say anything, just waited, my heart in my throat. I knew whatever he was about to ask would be the worst yet. "There's a location I need you to go to," he continued. "It's not far from where you are. You'll find the address in your email. Be there in an hour." I wanted to refuse, to tell him I was done, that I couldn't do this anymore. But I knew it was pointless. He had the video, the evidence that could destroy my life. I was trapped, and there was no way out. I checked my email, and sure enough, there was a new message with an address. It was an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place I'd never been but had heard about. One of those places with a reputation, where people say bad things happen. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had no choice. The drive was long and silent, the roads empty in the dead of night. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart. My hands were slick with sweat, my stomach churning with dread. I knew this was it, the final task, the last piece of his twisted game, and I had no idea what he had in store for me. When I arrived at the house, it was exactly as I'd imagined. Old, decrepit, the windows boarded up, the lawn overgrown with weeds. The whole place reeked of decay, of something long dead and forgotten. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. But there was no calming it. I was too far gone, too deep into this nightmare to think clearly anymore. I grabbed the phone and stepped out of the car, the night air cold and still. The house loomed in front of me like a specter, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I felt like I was walking into a tomb, a place where the living had no business being, but I couldn't turn back. Not now. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty house. Inside, it was even worse. Dark, damp, the air thick with the smell of rot and mildew. I could barely see anything, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the cracks in the boards. But I didn't need light to know that something was wrong. The whole place felt off, like it was filled with a presence, something watching me from the shadows. The phone buzzed in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. I looked down at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. "Go upstairs," the message read. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper, and started up the stairs. Each step creaked loudly under my weight, the sound grating on my nerves. The second floor was even darker, the hallway stretching out in front of me like a tunnel leading to some unknown horror. But I kept going, driven by a mix of fear and the knowledge that I had no other choice. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open. What I saw inside made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a small room, empty except for a single chair in the center. And in that chair was me, or at least it looked like me. The figure was bound to the chair, just like my boss had been, its head slumped forward, the face obscured by shadows. But I knew, deep down, that it was me. I don't know how, but I knew. The phone buzzed again, and I looked down at the screen, my vision swimming with terror. "End it," the message said. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, a trick of the light. But it wasn't. I could feel it, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. The figure in the chair stirred, its head slowly lifting to reveal a face that was mine. But it was twisted, distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. The eyes were hollow, empty, staring at me with a gaze that was both pleading and accusing. I dropped the phone, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But it was. I knew what he wanted me to do. He wanted me to kill myself, or whatever this thing was. I backed away, shaking my head, my mind screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the nightmare that had become my life. The figure in the chair spoke, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "You know what you have to do?" I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voice was inside my head, crawling under my skin, driving me to the brink of insanity. "No!" I screamed, the sound echoing off the walls. "I can't do this!" But the figure just stared at me, its hollow eyes boring into my soul. "You have no choice. This is the only way out." I fell to my knees, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to end it like this. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. He had driven me to this point, pushed me to the edge, and now there was only one way out. I don't know how long I sat there, on the cold, dirty floor, wrestling with the decision, but eventually, something inside me broke. I picked up the knife that had appeared on the floor, as if by magic, and stood up, my movements robotic, mechanical. The figure in the chair watched me, silent, waiting. I raised the knife, my hands trembling, and took a deep breath. And then, with a final, desperate cry, I plunged the knife into its chest. The figure let out a horrible, guttural scream, its body convulsing as the life drained out of it. Blood, my blood, spurted out, soaking the floor, the walls, everything. I stumbled back, dropping the knife, my vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The figure slumped forward, lifeless, the room falling into an eerie silence. I stood there panting, my mind reeling from what I'd just done. But as I looked down at the figure in the chair, something changed. The body began to dissolve, melting away like smoke, until there was nothing left but the empty chair and the blood-stained knife on the floor. The room was silent, the oppressive weight of the situation lifting slightly as the figure vanished. But the relief was short-lived. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. It was over. Or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. But deep down, I knew the truth. I could feel it in my bones. This nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The phone buzzed again, its sharp vibration cutting through the silence like a knife. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what he had to say, but I knew I had to. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, dread pooling in my stomach as I unlocked the screen. The message was short, just 3 words, but they hit me like a sledgehammer. Check the mirror. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The mirror, the small cracked mirror hanging on the wall across the room, the one I hadn't noticed before. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned to face it. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was twisted, warped, the same hollow eyes and distorted features that had stared back at me from the figure in the chair. It grinned at me, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide for any human face. My stomach churned as I took a step back, the horror of what I was seeing sinking in. The reflection began to move on its own, lifting a hand to wave at me, mocking me. It mouthed the words I didn't want to hear, the words that echoed in my mind like a death sentence. You're next. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore through the air. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the floor, and hurled it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 tiny shards that rained down onto the floor, but the image didn't disappear. It lingered in the broken pieces, each shard reflecting that same twisted grin, those same hollow eyes. I stumbled back, my mind spinning out of control. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. But it was. It was all too real, and I was trapped in it, with no way out. The phone buzzed one last time, the sound sending a jolt of terror through me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced down at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The message was simple, final. Goodbye. And then, the phone went dead. The screen flickered once, twice, and then it was gone. I dropped it, the lifeless device clattering to the floor as I backed away, my mind reeling. It was over. He was done with me. But I wasn't free. I would never be free. The room around me began to change, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I felt like I was drowning. The reflection in the shards of glass began to multiply, filling the room with countless versions of that twisted, grinning face, all staring at me, all waiting for the inevitable. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to shift and move, blocking my path, trapping me in this hellish nightmare. The faces closed in, their grins widening, their hollow eyes boring into me, consuming me. I fell to the floor, clutching my head, trying to block out the voices, the laughter, the endless echoes of my own distorted image. But it was no use. The darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me down into the abyss. And then, there was nothing. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The sun was shining through the window, the sounds of the city drifting in from outside. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, some twisted, horrible nightmare. But when I looked around, I knew the truth. The blood was still on my hands. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped in my own mind, a prisoner of the horrors I had unleashed. The reflection in the window was still there, grinning at me, mocking me, reminding me that I would never escape. I was no longer in control. He was. And that's when I knew. He hadn't just destroyed my life, he had taken it. I was nothing more than a hollow shell, a puppet to be controlled, a reflection of the monster he had turned me into. There's no escape from this, no waking up, no going back to the way things were. I'm stuck in this nightmare, and I know it will never end. So if you're reading this, take my warning seriously. Don't go looking for answers on the dark web. Don't let your curiosity lead you down the path I took. Because once you start, there's no turning back. There's no escape. He's still out there, watching, waiting. And if you're not careful, you could be next.